Rob, thank you so much for the introduction. I think Powderfly is such a powerful platform. We love being your partners. As Rob said, my name is David Morgan, and I am the president of the Multicultural Media and Correspondents Association. I'm proud to represent a growing army of BIPOC media stakeholders that resolve to secure the power that comes from owning and distributing our content and controlling how our story is told. I encourage you to follow us on social media. You see the sign in the back. Sign up for our newsletter to learn more about our advocacy, our programs, and our events. So I just want to jump in. Please join me in welcoming David Johns. David, it's so good to have you. I'm glad we're having this conversation, bro. And I'm doing it in Pride Month. So what's up with that?
Intentionality. I appreciate it.
I love it. I love it. So seriously, what's up, Brother Johns? First, let me say, again, an happy Pride Month. Congratulations on all your success. You run the seminal advocacy organization for racial equity and LGBTQ plus equity. You're an influencer, you're a scholar, and most importantly, you seem to move with such power. You're having such impact, all while dealing with the reality of being same gender loving Black man in America. So my first question to you is, what has that journey been like for you? And what is your North Star that keeps you going and so on point?
Yeah, I'll start at the end and work my way backwards. My North Star is knowing that as long as there have been Black people, we've been beautifully and incredibly diverse. Even before the terms LGBTQIA plus existed, and I'm going to come back to SGL because I know there are a lot of people that are like, what the hell is that? Even before those terms existed, we showed up in queer ways, in ways that were not pejorative or otherwise assumed to be normal or traditional in a Western Eurocentric context. I'm talking specifically about the implications of white supremacy and anti-Blackness in colonial America. And I'm also guided by the knowledge that none of us are free unless and until all of us are free. I love Black folk, FOLX. And so I do this work knowing that it is a privilege and an honor to stand in a long legacy of race warriors who otherwise understood that these things are important to do. I mentioned coming back to SGL. So I don't use the term gay. I don't use the term gay because words matter. And often, again, because of the ways that white supremacy and anti-Blackness works, when people hear the word gay, they think white. In the same way that I use Black American, because the absence of Black leaves often the assumption of it applying to white Americans. And beyond that, gay is often that leads people to thinking about deviancy and then sex. And so I prefer to use the term same gender loving, created by a Black man. It centers me being proud of being both an African descendant as well as a man who was same gender loving. And it has the word love in it, which is seldom included when people have conversations about queer things or queer people.
Man, I love it. That's powerful. Same gender loving. No, that's good. I appreciate the education. So, I want to, I want to talk around the media piece, but I want to start off by talking about what you do at the National Black Justice Coalition, the important work you're doing. Specifically, I'd love for you to just tell our audience what's the most important thing they should know about the NBJC. And can you just make it more real by providing some examples of the projects you're working on and what are some of the resources that you provide?
Yeah, I should be able to do that, right? We're the nation's only civil rights organization at the intersections of racial equity and LGBTQIA plus equality. So we exist to trouble the reality that I just described, which is that when traditional civil rights organizations, the NAACP, the National Urban League, the National Action Network, when they show up, they're often not showing up with a lens of intersectionality to acknowledge that there are people like me who show up in the world. And then conversely, often when organizations like HRC or other queer organizations are showing up, there's similarly not an intersectional lens that acknowledges that there are also Black people who are members of the LGBTQIA plus community. And so we exist to be disruptive and to ensure that stories about Black people and queer people acknowledge that there are intersections that too frequently go ignored and unacknowledged. And that is important because, and it shows up in our work in at least 3 ways. One is we advance federal public policy. Acknowledging that policy is incredibly important for the moments when people don't have a proper support or resources or instruction, or otherwise fail to live up to being a decent human being. And so one of the ways that I'll anchor that is to talk about the importance of passing the Equality Act, which we're working on now. It's being held by members of the Republican caucus in the Senate. And it's important because many Americans assume that I have civil rights protections from discrimination, bias, and stigma, that I don't, that I quite frankly do not. I can be kicked out of, and I just told the story to a media partner yesterday, I can be kicked out of an Uber because the driver asks questions about why I have nail polish on my nails, or assumes that the male person that I'm with is possibly my partner. I could still be denied access to food at a bakery because they think that it might be tasting for a union, and they want to hide behind religion and deny me the opportunity to order the things that other people are able to order because it's a public space. And so we're fighting to pass the Equality Act to address some of that, and that's one example. Another example is that we do a lot of work around messaging, and this is incredibly important given the audience. Just this morning, I was flustered, flummoxed, and frustrated because there's an article published by the Huffington Post that says a Virginia Tech linebacker beat a Tinder date to death after discovering he was a man, told prosecutors. And so I say this to say a couple of things. One, we are on track for this to be the deadliest year on record for Black trans women, as has been the case for at least the last 5 years. Black trans women die at a disproportionate rate compared to other communities of trans women and women more generally. And it often happens in silence, in part because messengers around what is happening to people erase them in their lives. So my first question is, was she a trans woman? Was she a trans woman? If she was, there's no acknowledgement of her identity, how she showed up in the world. If she was a man, I have questions about why he would identify in that way on a dating app. And let's just say that either of those cases are true. This headline is leading, suggesting that this young man was tricked in a way that would justify him killing somebody, when there are at least 101 solutions that I can think of, including just leave. And so much of the work we have to do is to engage in conversations with members of the media to talk about the importance of not dead naming or misgendering people, so that we can at least honor them in death when they weren't honored in life. So that's the second way that we show up and try and do our work. The last is we create spaces for members of our community to show up and be themselves without apologizing or shrinking. In a week, we will remember, as a nation, we should all remember the tragedy that happened at Pulse in Orlando. During that weekend, 5 years ago, NBJC collaborated with the White House Initiative on Educational Access for African Americans to produce the first ever White House Summer for LGBTQIA+ youth. For all of the reasons that I mentioned, and because things are more challenging for students, for babies who didn't ask to be born, who are forced to go to schools that they don't choose, to be with educators who could choose to be in another profession. But right now, students who are soon to be LGBTQIA+, we'll put an asterisk there because I'll come back to it. But students who are soon to be, or who might identify as queer, which is crazy in and of itself when you just stop for a second to think about people come in and out of identities over the course of their lifetime for different reasons and in different ways. That children, we should all remember what it was like to be a child, fraught with all kind of tension and anxieties. By design, it's an important developmental phase, but to assume that children are ready for the weight that comes with these socially constructed categories is just asinine. But the point here is that children right now are not protected in schools that they're forced to go to. There's always something going on. In schools that they're forced to go to. And so we created this summit to provide them with space so that they could make recommendations so that we could do better.
Man, you're just dropping such power. You just embody power. So let me just talk a little bit about some specifics. Tell me a little bit about some of the programs and resources that individuals can access. Because I know there's one directory that, yeah. So yeah, tell me what are you guys doing that people can latch on to either sort of help or get resources from?
Yeah, I'll give you three. One is Equality for All. It's a coalition of a number of national organizations like NBJC, the Human Rights Campaign, the National LGBTQ Task Force, and others. And we are singularly focused on passing the Equality Act. So I implore you to visit that website. There are lots of ways that you can get engaged depending on where you are and what you care most about. And so that's one. The second is we have a nbjc.org, a resource tab, where we produce toolkits and other assets that members of the media can and should use to help tell beautifully colored stories, to go back to the Assistant President's remarks in the opening package. Two that I think are really important to lift up. There's a Stolen Lives website that tells the stories of Black trans women who were murdered and offers language around ways to avoid dead naming or misgendering folks in our community. So I encourage folks to utilize that. Another is around HIV and AIDS. Since the introduction of the epidemic in the late 80s, it continues to disproportionately impact all Black people. Black, cis, heterosexual women die disproportionately as a result of HIV and AIDS, as do Black, gay, and same-gender loving men. The term the CDC uses also includes MSM, which is problematic because it includes trans men who are not men. So all of this to say that there are toolkits that provide language that literally say, don't tell stories that include things like full-blown AIDS, because it was a term that was used by the media to conjure up images of HIV as something that might burst onto people at any given moment. The technical term is actually stage 3 HIV. So use a technical term, try and reduce stigma, and hopefully we can create spaces where people feel much more comfortable to do what Billy Porter just did. After living without publicly talking about being HIV positive for decades. Literally before 2021, most people could not name a Black person, a highly visible Black person outside of Magic Johnson, who was living with AIDS. And we know based on sheer mathematical limitations that that's wrong. And so much of what we understand that contributes to the disproportionate rate at which we test positive as a result of HIV/AIDS and end up dying from HIV/AIDS is stigma, which again is something that when I think about the importance of communication, we can control. The last resource is we worked with the Congressional Black Caucus just to make a policy connection a year ago to produce a report called Ring the Alarm, in part because the mental health challenges of Black folk generally, and then Black folks with intersection identity, so Black folks with disabilities, Black queer folks, Black folks who are not Christians, Black folks for whom this country is not their country of origin. We face additional challenges resulting from prolonged exposure to poverty and toxic stress and trauma. And the thing that most people miss in all of that is that the suicide rates for Black youth have doubled in the last 2 decades, while they decreased for everybody else. So one, we're not talking about mental health. Suicide is still seen as a white kid's thing. So there's no conversation or focus about it in Black communities, and everybody else is getting better, while Black kids are getting worse at an alarming rate. So the report is titled Ring the Alarm, and thankful to Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman for shining a light on and driving resources to a space that deserves much more attention.
Man, I love it. You're just dropping so much knowledge. So, we have our audience, it's a fairly diverse audience, people in the workforce. Let me ask you, before I, again, jump deep into the media, let's talk about this allyship concept around, how are you feeling about the level of allyship that you're coming across, you see in both the media, socially and culturally, but also from when you talk to friends in the workplace, because I know a lot of your friends work in corporate America. What are they sort of, what's your advice to them and those that are actually sort of Black LGBTQIA, but also allies who now want to become more aware, more helpful, because I put myself in that category that I
Yeah.
really want to be a true ally. And so educate us for a little bit right now.
Yeah, so I appreciate that, David. I celebrate you, but the goal is not allyship. The goal is for you to become an active accomplice. And here's why.
Say that again. Say that word again.
You want to move from active accomplice. You want to move from being an ally to working every day to be an active accomplice. And here's why. Allyship has become incredibly performative. And it's almost like a jersey that people are putting on themselves rather than doing the work to get on the team and then having the team give you the jersey, right? You ain't put in the work to go through the NBA trials. You walked up in the NBA store and purchased the jersey, right? And at all. You ain't go to the gym now one time. You ain't give a water bottle, but you out here. You out here at you at the parade. You got on all of your rainbows and glitter, and it's most apparent to me during the month of June, where corporations engage in pride pimping. I was just in New York 2 days ago and stayed at a hotel across from the UGG store. And there was not a square inch of this 2-story store on Fifth Avenue that was not colored in a rainbow color. Then they threw in all the glitter that they could find. And then the question for me becomes, how is this very public performance that has nothing to do with me? I'm clear, just like trauma, that ain't got shit to do with me. How does that translate to things that otherwise might impact me? And so to your question about corporations, what I know is that there are companies, some that our friends work for, that engage in pride pimping and have all kind of campaigns going on right now with rainbows and gay folks on them. But AT&T donated $275 million to 193 anti-gay politicians. Comcast donated almost $3 billion to 154 anti-gay politicians. Home Depot, close to 2 million. General Electric, close to 1.3. Verizon, 1.2. Pfizer, 100,000 to 52. Right, like this matters at a point in time when there have been more than 110 anti-trans pieces of legislation introduced at state legislatures across the country to date. Like legislation that fundamentally is a solution to a problem that doesn't exist, that fundamentally changes the relationship between medical providers who took a Hippocratic oath and their patients, that flies in the face of science, that assumes things about biology and anatomy that just aren't true, and that penalizes, while most of them have fair in the title, again, to the point of messaging, penalize mostly girls, trans girls. And so I'm not interested in allyship when you can dress in a flag and throw a parade and then contribute to the ability for politicians to pass legislation that I think relegating folks to second-class citizenship is too passé at this point, given the policy violence that we continue to see, given the policy violence that encourage hundreds of thousands of people to risk their lives in the middle of a global pandemic to join a movement for Black lives. And so the goal, again, should not be allyship. It should be active accomplishment, which requires people to feel comfortable.
No, I got it. So just jumping to media, I often critique the mainstream media. I believe that as currently constituted, it lacks the diversity of representation needed to adequately cover stories or incorporate this perspective of BIPOC communities. Like, my man Ice Cube said 30 years ago, boys in the hood, either they don't know, they don't show, or they don't care what's going on in their hood. And I bet this inadequacy is even more pronounced for the Black LGBTQIA plus community. What's your perspective, and what should we be doing? Yeah, so what's your perspective? Let's start there first.
All of that's true, but I want to have this conversation not from a deficit perspective, but from an asset perspective. So the reality is that it has always been the case that in spite of the power structure that results from, again, white supremacy, anti-Blackness, what Black feminists refer to as the matrix of domination, the signs, systems, and symbols that allow white supremacy to be omnipresent yet hyper invisible. Like those forces have always existed, and there have always been architects, primarily Black, queer, trans, and non-binary folk, who found ways to hack solutions to those. I'm sitting under a poster by Rustin, who literally is the architect of the March on Washington, who introduced pacifism to Dr. King and so many other leaders of seminal moments in the movement for Black lives, right? At this moment, so many of the organizations that are associated with formally the movement for Black lives, the BLM organization, things nationally that are tethered to what people are naming BLM, those organizations, those movements are led by Black, queer, trans, and non-binary folk. And many of them are leveraging tools, social media platforms included, websites, if they have resources to be able to build them, and have other forms of generating content that exist and can and should be used by people who are in positions of power, who understand the importance of painting vividly colored pictures, right, in terms of communications in this regard. So that's one. The second is yes, right? Like we don't have to go deep on it. Like there are too many old white men and people who value the feelings and perspectives of old white men who are in positions of power. And we could have a whole nother conversation about why that's problematic. What I will say is that Edelman released a report in February of 2021, shout out to mutual friend Trish Smith, that showed that companies who make investments in this regard do better. They do better with regard to employee retention, with regard to employee output. They also do better with regard to profit because people are watching what corporations and companies and brands are doing or not doing, or saying and are not saying, and are following that up with where they're investing their time and their dollars.
So, no, I love it. So the media companies we're working with, to be candid, they've acknowledged that, they need work, and they're telling me they're making incremental steps, and, some are actually doing that. But tell us, so what do we need to do more concretely to accelerate these efforts? And so to the point where they are making hires and they are changing career, how do we accelerate it, and how do we make sure it's more extended across all the networks? Like, what are some of the tangibles?
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and I roll my eyes are smiling because I think to myself, it's a growth hyper exaggeration, but just go with me, right? Like, folks, enslaved Africans were consulted in the process of designing the transatlantic slave trade. That we continue to be asked how to fix it is beyond vexing to me. The short answer to your question is tied to folks' compensation. Tied to folks' compensation. It makes no sense to me that corporate giants like Google and Facebook, who can engineer pages to influence elections, can't figure out how to solve basic DE&I issues tied to somebody's compensation.
That's what's up. Money talks, right? We're actually at the 30 minutes already, and I didn't take any audience questions. But let me do this because we do have some corporate execs and hiring managers on the call that have the power to move the needle. So what is the core message you want to leave them with to resonate, like that we now could push out on MMCA? We can have our partners, Power to Fly, push out that message. What is that core message that Brother John wanted to leave them with?
It's the question that I often sit with in conversations like this, especially during Pride Month and during Black History Month, is what do you really value? Right? At its core, so much of the work that we do at NBJC is about inviting people to demonstrate that which they purport to care about, that it manifests in the things that they otherwise invest in. And it confounds me that we are still having conversations about the value of DE&I, allowing people the grace to say, I just don't know how to figure it out, when in any other space or sector or instance, it just wouldn't be tolerated. It just wouldn't. And I hope that there's always a way that I will make somebody uncomfortable or say something provocative that will spark something in them that helps them understand that this work is important. And there's a part of me that's just like, if you don't understand the value in this, then you should choose another profession. It's the same message for educators that don't understand why they need to increase their vocabulary or their compassion to make space for children who are forced to be in a space that they have a whole lot of agency over whether or not they have to choose to be in. And this isn't just about queer stuff. We know that the automotive industry benefited from having more diverse engineering teams when they were trying to figure out how to create airbags that still weren't killing white men because they just weren't good enough. And so I offer the Edelman report to say there's a financial value in it. I tried with the humanities stuff to say, like, we all purport to live in a country where we value each other's humanity and the ability to exist freely. We're about to celebrate 4th of July for folks to have family. And if we can acknowledge the, not only just irony, but the contradictions in that alone, we are a country that celebrates family, but then want to create laws that deny people the ability to celebrate family. We are a country that celebrates freedom and then create laws that literally deny people the opportunity to show up in ways that look like freedom. So I just want us to do better.
I'm going to hit you with one. I know we're running over, but I've seen something come across. You know, we are MMCAs, like, who owns the story controls who wins and loses, right? So I wish more people could hear your message, the clarity, sort of the conviction of purpose and how you speak. Tell me, why is it so important to you? And how do you see your role as being a voice for a community that, quite candidly, is often voiceless and misunderstood, unappreciated? Like, how do you see yourself in that important space?
Yeah, again, some of that is true, but some of it's not. So let's trouble it. Like, our community has loud voices. In fact, we are targets because people they are afraid of it. People are afraid of the way in which we tell truth, the way in which we highlight systems that allow people to be protected by privilege. None of this is by design. All of the statistics that I offer, I can explain the context. I'm a sociologist. I have the degrees to justify the stuff that I otherwise know based on lived experience. But again, the information that I have access to, everybody has access to as well. Well, some of it. I worked really hard to get to this place, but use resources like Google. And so again, I say that to say that I don't want anybody to ever say again that we don't have voices. We do. Whether or not people in positions of power based on other systems choose to listen, different conversation, but I want to change the frame, right? And I also want to honor that I'm not singular in this regard. I very much accept, again, this responsibility that I have that comes with some of the opportunities that I've been entrusted with. But there are other folks who are doing this in powerful ways. So I'm gonna go hard left. People right now should be watching The Real Housewives of New York and The Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. Right now, in this moment, this season, Garcelle Bouvet and Ebony K. Williams are forcing privileged ass white women and the nations that watch them to have versions of these conversations. They're talking about white fragility. They are challenging assumptions that people make about what it means for those of us who speak so well, who are clean and articulate, to show up and be able to talk with clarity about all of the ways in which sometimes y'all just got us fucked up. And it is, for me, as incredibly important as me showing up to have this conversation with you to make people uncomfortable or otherwise connect dots that might have existed in people's constellations. So it is never that we aren't doing what we otherwise do. It's whether or not folks who are in positions where they appoint themselves to be leaders are actually leading in ways that are authentic and inclusive.
That's a mic drop. Thank you, Brother Johns. And thank you all for tuning in. Please be sure to go to @MMCA DC right now. Follow us on social media, then go to our website and join our mailing list. We love you. We need you to survive so we can have more of these conversations. David out. David out. Thank you, my brother.
Thank you both so much. That was absolutely wonderful. And I completely agree. That was a mic drop moment. So thank you both for sharing that chat with the rest of us.